Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 31st of October, 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Scott and Mark Anderson from the USA. Well, we're going to kick straight off with the BBC's breaking headlines. The BBC seems to have caught up with the fact that overnight there have been really heavy Russian missile strikes in Ukraine. This has been widely reported more or less from the time it occurred on social media, but the BBC's taken some time to catch up. We need to remember that in Ukraine, Zelensky has put pressure on people on social media not to report what's been happening with Russian attacks and missile strikes. So there has definitely been a drop-off in accurate social media from inside Ukraine, and clearly now we're seeing a highly controlled media environment in Ukraine. Well, let's have a look at how the BBC did it, and of course they had to put in their huge breaking news banner because they just managed to catch up with social media. This is the meat of the report: massive missile strikes across Ukraine, including Kiev. At least 2 blasts were reported there. One resident told the BBC his district was now without electricity. It goes on to talk about Kharkiv, and it says the strikes come after Russia blamed Ukraine for a drone attack on its Black Sea fleet in the annexed Crimea. And I think you're going to come on to that and give us a bit more about that attack. But the BBC here really reporting nothing new, because the Russians have been heavily attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly electricity and water, over a great many days. This was another shot from the BBC Specialist Ukraine page. And what I found particularly interesting here, apart from the power and water hit in Russian strikes, was top center. There's a little article there inside the US military cyber team's defense of Ukraine. And we'll do more on that article, but just to flag up today that what this is telling us is that the American military are inside Ukraine to help control media. And I think this is a very critical thing for people to understand in the West. So if we actually have a look at how social media reported things, this is a Ukraine map showing where air raid warnings were posted. And this is across the whole of the Ukraine area. But if we keep it simple, those strikes have been targeting electricity and water utility infrastructure. And it's now estimated that the damage is to well over 30%, somewhere between 30 and 40%. And of course, aside from losing electricity, it's also meant very big outages of rail communications and tram capacity. And we understand that diesel engines have been brought in to cover some of the areas where electric trains can no longer function. But also communications are down, and that includes the internet. And we just want to add to that image, if we can pop it back, that we need to remember here that the BBC has been falsely claiming for several months now that the Russians had run out of missiles and weapons. So no sign of that in reality, more false reporting from the BBC. And not sure whether this one will play, but a little video showing the sorts of missile launches that the Russians were able to conduct at the moment. And it's quite clear that any reports that the Russians have run out of ammunition is completely wrong. So the situation across the front is largely that it's either static or the Russians are attacking vigorously in areas of key interest. I've taken just a few screenshots from the YouTube site Defense Politics Asia. Very clear reports. People might like to go and look at this for themselves. But what we're really seeing is an indication of attacks taking place from the Ukrainian side at a number of points along the front without any substantial progress. It doesn't matter where we go in Ukraine at the moment. The only progress that is being made is by Russian forces. Up in the north of the country, it's the same situation. There have been localized Ukrainian attacks with very heavy losses without any significant progress. And we'll just show you this very short clip, an analysis from Defense Politics Asia, which really sums up how the Russians are dealing with things at the moment. Let's look at this clip.
Hello everyone, this is Defense Politics Asia, and this is a quick update over here at the Donetsk front. Particularly, we are talking about the Voleda region and the Pelivka settlement. So at this Voleda region, the Russian forces have launched a major assault against Voleda, and the attack is preceded with a major artillery strike, and then the drones were then suicide drones were then launched to attack Ukrainian surface-to-air missile vehicles like the Buk M1, and they were taken out on the western side of Voleda. The Russian forces attacked the eastern side of Voleda, and they are currently have fire control over this road here, which is an important resupply and communication route for the Ukrainians to Voleda, as well as it stretches all the way to Pelivka. The Voleda is a very important location because it actually acts like a fortress, because it have high-rise buildings in a very low-lying region. So basically everything here is just super flat, and Voleda is actually a settlement of high-rise building built on top of a really small hill, and as a result they have a very good site and strategic position across this entire region.
So if viewers would like to see that full report, go to Defense Politics Asia on YouTube and you can follow it through. But of course, one of the things he's talking about is very heavy artillery attacks by the Russians. So again, more evidence that to talk about the Russians running out of ammunition is nonsense. David, you have some slightly different views on how you see the fighting, but it seems to me at the moment that we have a terrible situation where some very brave Ukrainian soldiers are fighting now against forces and defences. They have no chance of breaking through. And really, what is the West achieving in this war? It is more and more Ukrainian casualties. The West would like Ukraine to fight until the last soldier dies.
Well, the view we've had from the outset has been that that the plan to have NATO expansion into Ukraine was only going to end up one way, with the Ukrainians finding their country wrecked, and that's what's clearly happening. As far as the war is concerned, I mean, we had three phases. We had the initial kind of charge in with the Russians, hoping, I think, that the Ukrainian regime would simply fold. That didn't happen. There was then a relatively rapid advance in the south and east, resisted with some desperation by the Ukrainians, quite heavy losses, but eventually stopped. And then there was a shift when the Ukrainians were able to launch their own offensives and take back sizable amounts of territory. This was the effect of the Western support and training and munitions. And this prompted a change in the Russian approach and a mobilization of 300,000 men. And that meant we were going into the fourth phase. And I think we're now starting to see that. So there's been a shift, that the offensives are now more Russian than Ukrainian, and the point of balance may have tipped in favour of the Russians once again, with all of these additional resources that they have assembled and put into action. Some 300,000 men were mobilised. This is more than doubling the Russian troop numbers in the area, so this is going to have a very significant effect. Against that background, where is the political effort for ceasefire, for negotiations, for some sort of peaceful settlement? It's nowhere. There is no political intervention here. There is no political idea at all. And how does this work out? Well, I can't see it working out well for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's a very sad state of affairs. But the thing we're not seeing from the West, from UK, is any calls for an end to the fighting. It's clear that we want it to continue as long as possible.
It's going to be a pretty horrendous winter for them, with so much infrastructure being totally destroyed. It goes a bit beyond some increased gas prices. Here they will have none.
Well,
and
they,
some
they could have
significantly
no
colder
heating
temperatures.
and no water, Mike.
Yes.
Yeah, very serious.
Okay, let's move on to this then, because this is just an incredible story that the Mail appears to have broken on Sunday, or for the Mail on Sunday anyway. They call it a Mail on Sunday exclusive. Liz Truss's personal phone that was hacked by Kremlin agents was so compromised it was locked away in a secure location, as experts fear top secret negotiations and private messages may have been leaked. Now, the Mail on Sunday reported this, and it did get some traction elsewhere. But apparently one of the key points here is that this hack was discovered prior to the leadership election, Brian, and that Boris Johnson, while he was still Prime Minister, decided that it was best, and Simon Case as well, who of course is the Cabinet Secretary, decided that it was best if this story was suppressed. So they suppressed the story, and as a result, someone who allowed their phone to be hacked because they were using their personal phone for government business ended up becoming the Prime Minister. This is quite an incredible situation.
Well, one of my key points over recent days, Mike, has been who is it that produces the next Prime Minister? Who are the people who meet in rooms? Where are the minutes? Who are the people? Where are the minutes of their meetings? Of course, the UK public simply not told. It's a dictatorship at work in UK. It's very obvious now.
So let's put the Mail back on and see what it said. It said it's understood that messages which fell into foreign hands include criticisms, mistrust, and our future Chancellor, Mr. Kwarteng, made of Boris Johnson, leading to the potential risk of blackmail. I don't think that would be the biggest risk of blackmail, but anyway, sources said that up to a year's worth of messages were downloaded. They are also believed to include highly sensitive discussions with senior international foreign ministers about the war in Ukraine, including detailed discussion about arms shipments. And the Mail goes on to say the astonishing incident disclosed by security sources solves the mystery of why Ms. Truss was forced to change the mobile number she used for over a decade shortly before becoming Prime Minister. The move caused anxiety among cabinet ministers and advisors who were suddenly unable to contact her. And again, I'm going to ask, what on earth was MI5 and MI6 doing? How did they not do something to prevent her becoming Prime Minister? Because surely part of their role is to vet people who are taking positions.
Supposedly it is, but as we heard from Alex the other day, it appears that when you get up the food chain, you're considered automatically trustworthy, and the vetting procedures for mere military people don't take place. So presumably the same was true with Ms. Truss.
So let's bring Anthony Glees on screen then. And he's from Buckingham University. He's widely considered to be an expert in these areas. He said the implications are horrifying. We now know a foreign power hacked the personal mobile phone of the talkative Liz Truss. The severity of this security breach can hardly be overstated. As a former Prime Minister, ex-Foreign Secretary and ex-International Trade Secretary, Ms. Truss was the chief custodian of our national security secrets and the recipient of invaluable MI6 intelligence. We need an immediate judicial inquiry led by a High Court judge to establish how this happened, who was responsible, and precisely what information was compromised. I believe Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time, should not have suppressed the news, although it's possible there were sound security reasons why this had to be done. If the media had been able to report the story, Liz Truss would have had no choice but to resign. It goes without saying that her ambitions to lead the country would have been over. Now, this was then followed up in the Mail by another article. Ministers ordered by spy chiefs to stop using their mobile phones after suspected Kremlin hack on Liz Truss sparks security clampdown. And it says ministers will be warned they should never use their personal mobile phones to conduct government business. Now, do they need this warning? This is quite incredible to me that they do. But anyway, that's what the Mail is reporting. But let's just remember over the last couple of weeks what the Russians have been saying. This is Igor Kirillov, sorry, the commander of Russia's Nuclear Protection Corps, talking about the United Kingdom, specifically singling out the United Kingdom as being involved in the production of a dirty bomb for use in Ukraine. We also have Russia saying that British forces blew up Nord Stream. UK denies the claim in this headline. And here's the BBC, massive drone attack of Black Sea Fleet. And the key quote here is, without providing evidence, Russia accused British troops of being involved in Saturday's attack. So the question is, how did Russia know? If Russia is very clearly singling out the UK here, do they know something? Have they discovered something from Liz Truss's phone? Well, we can't know that, but these are questions that I think that need to be asked. But Kim Dotcom, who, as we know, is on the various Ukrainian kill lists, he had something to say over the weekend on Twitter. He said, how do the Russians know that the UK blew up the Nord Stream pipelines in partnership with the US? Because Liz Truss used her iPhone to send a message to Senator Blinken saying it's done a minute after the pipeline blew up and before anybody else knew, ? So he's asking the question. And he's making the suggestion that, in fact, it wasn't her phone that was hacked, but her iCloud account. But anyway, that's what he says. And he goes on to say, it's not just the Five Eyes that have backdoor admin access to all the big tech databases. Russia and China have sophisticated cyber units too. The funny thing is, government officials with top security clearance still prefer using iPhones over their NSA and GCHQ issued encrypted phones. So anyway, I just want to bring this on screen because this, I think, really changes the context by which what happened with Suella Braveman, how we might think about this. So this was a headline: Suella Braveman resigns as Home Secretary after sharing secure information from private email and takes aim at Liz Truss in departure. And David, the key point here is that Suella Braverman's resignation brought Liz Truss down, and effectively did anyway, and she is no longer Prime Minister. But I just find it fascinating that was the excuse, that was the wrongdoing. I think there's many questions to be asked around this story.
Oh, for sure. I mean, who in their right mind would discuss arms shipments to Ukraine over a mobile phone? I mean, really? Surely that someone in that position would be well briefed on the vulnerability of that means of communication. I find that just quite astonishing.
But we also had the incident, didn't we, where Ben Wallace was caught with a comedian, a Russian comedian, I can't think of the man's name, who called him, and he thought, Ben Wallace thought he was actually talking to Zelensky. At the time, I thought, what an incredible breach of security, because how did that phone number get out? But of course, what we've got to remember is that over a great many years, we've been shown time and time again how good the Russians are at espionage. And we know at the moment how particularly good they are at matters to do with technology relating to signals communication. So this is a shambolic situation, but once again, it was covered up. Boris Johnson is in the middle of this, and yet this was an incredible security breach. If I may, Mark, I'll just ask you for some comment, because I see a slight irony that whilst the Americans have put in what must be a very expensive social media signals intelligence team into Ukraine, it appears that the British politicians are simply chatting over their mobile phones. It's laughable.
Yeah, and that's why I'm laughing. Yeah, it's ironic and laughable if they're so serious about the conduct of this war and the fact that they want to prevail over the Russian autocrat Putin and whatnot, that they'd be so casual about it. But America's involvement is not surprising, but it illustrates how important information is, how much that is superior in warfare to anything you do militarily with ordnance or with explosives. Intelligence is everything and information is everything. And so America is playing some subterranean advisory role that could very well grow. And it's just a question of what path or what avenue that growth might take and how fast it might go. So that's something to really keep a close eye on, is exactly what are the states doing. remembering that in 2014, they helped overthrow the pro-Russian Ukrainian leader in the first place. So what are they up to now? I'm sure it'll go beyond what we're hearing, and we need to keep a close eye on that. That would be what I would offer for now.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on then. And some time ago, we created this website, the COVID-19. This is the yellowcard.ukcolumn.org website, all about COVID-19 vaccine analysis. And the reason that we did this was because the MHRA had made access that, although they made access to the data available, they made it available in such a format that it was really useless to anybody for finding out anything about what was going on with COVID-19 vaccines. So look, we have done the same for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and you can find this new website at fcdospending.ukcolumn.org because the Foreign Office publishes all their spending over £25,000 on a fairly regular basis. Now, the most recent data is up until May 2022, and it begins in September 2020, and that's because at this point we have only added the data since the merger of the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development. We'll be adding data prior to that very, very shortly. But look, if we put this back on screen a second, we've got a little video clip here, which hopefully will play. Sorry, let's go back. There we go. So, and there's a filter form there, and this just gives you a very brief idea of how many organizations the Foreign Office is putting money into. And the basic point about this is that although we can discover who is getting paid and how much they're getting paid and when they're getting paid, we don't find out from the Foreign Office data what they're getting paid for. So one of the key points here is that we're going to ask everybody to get involved in trying to find out what the money is being spent on specifically. And that's going to involve lots of freedom of information requests. But if we just very briefly put this on screen, this is the spending month by month since September 2020 until May 2022. And one of the real key periods here, I think, Brian, is February, because it's just immediately prior to the start of the Ukrainian conflict. And suddenly there was this huge spending spree by the Foreign Office just prior to Ukraine conflict beginning. They effectively doubled the amount of money that they spent, nearly £1 billion in 1 month being spent on Foreign Office projects. But if we take a couple of examples, let's look at what they've spent on BBC Media Action. Well, we're showing a trend graph to show how much they're spending per month. But if we look at some of the detail, can you see how much they're spending there, Brian, top right-hand corner?
452.
No, above that in red.
£8.5
million
okay.
in that period on BBC Media Action. If we look at the British Council, it's even better because there they've spent £345 million in that period. And look, here's the key point. When I say that we don't know what they're spending it on, it all gets allocated to an accounting line, which in this case is called program spend, which is held in an Oracle database. But we don't know what the money's being spent on, and we need to start finding out what the money's being spent on. But this is, for anybody researching the activities of the Foreign Office, I think a brilliant resource, and we just would like to see people sharing this as widely as possible.
Indeed, well, it is a brilliant resource, and of course the yellow card changed a lot of people's views on what was happening around vaccine adverse reactions and the recording of the data. And this, I think, is going to do the same. Huge amounts of money. For anybody who doesn't know, BBC Media Action claims to be a charity that works alongside the BBC. It's funded by governments, including overseas governments, the Americans, for example. And its activities seem to be particularly dubious because, of course, in Syria, UK column highlighted the fact that their project managers were boasting that they could help achieve regime change by working with dissidents in Syria. So presumably the same thing is happening in Ukraine because, of course, BBC Media Action has been working in Ukraine in order to set up Zelensky's media system via the organization Suspilny. So vast amounts of money going into a charity. That's what the public's being told. That is a lie. David, it seems to be pretty obvious now that we are dealing with a government that is in UK that is absolutely out of control. We have no idea what the morality of politicians is. We have no idea what their business connections are. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know who chooses the Prime Minister, but we are getting to see who lies in order to cover up the truth about what has been happening. You called it a government of occupation some time ago, and I think this is beginning to fit more and more.
Well, I mean, what you're seeing here is just the sheer waste on one level. There's obviously agendas being played out, so it's not simply waste. It's what they're doing. They're doing in the dark. They're doing in secret. They're doing in our name, and we don't know. You're quite right. We don't know what it is. The spike in spending immediately before the Ukraine war is extremely concerning. What exactly is going on here? And this is all meant to be stuff that's, rather public spirited and helping charities and doing good and all the rest of it. That shouldn't be correlated with the outbreak of, well, it shouldn't precede the outbreak of war, shall we say. And then there's the sheer waste of it. We have economic crises. We have a situation where in Britain and indeed throughout the West, we can no longer afford our governments. They're all operating on ever-increasing amounts of debt, borrowing from the future to pay for today. We can't afford this. And it is crushing and drowning out actual economic activity and causing an impoverishment of the entire nation. And what are they spending it on? It doesn't look very impressive. It looks like rampant waste and people in power without any accountability, without any responsibility, or without any integrity, spending money like it's water, it would appear.
Yes, and just 2 quick points. I've already identified, we'll come on to detail of this in the future, but I've already identified one tranche of money that went to a company, and the money was sent into the company's bank account on the day that the company was dissolved. So that, there are questions involved here. And I'm just going to say, we've got to thank our membership for the fact that this website exists, because it's your support that has brought it about.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody has said, is this just a slush fund for black ops, presumably referring to Ukraine, but also other countries? And I think the answer to that idea is yes, it probably is.
Okay, David, let's move to Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon.
News. We've actually got news from Scotland. Something new has happened in Scotland. There's been a rebellion, a genuine backbench rebellion in the SNP. This has never really happened before. We didn't know what one would look like. In fact, we wondered what it would take. We'd had named person, various types of fascism, and none of that sparked any rebellion, but they've eventually done it. And it's over the controversial gender reform bill. So this is, they've even lost a minister. Ash Regan said her conscience, and who knew that that word would ever be used in the Scottish Parliament, her conscience would not allow her to vote in favour of legislation to induce a gender self-ID system in Scotland. So this is the first rebellion in 15 years, and as we move on, the system being proposed by the Scottish Government would allow Scots to change their sex by simply signing a declaration, with 16 and 17-year-olds being able to obtain gender recognition certificates for the first time. What could go wrong with that? Ms Regan, MSP for Edinburgh East, said she'd taken a decision to resign after considering the issue of gender recognition reform for some time. Quote, "I have concluded that my conscience will not allow me to vote with the government," she said in a resignation letter issued 35 minutes before the debate was due to begin. Consequently, continuing quote, "Consequently, I am writing to resign my position in the Scottish Government as Minister for Community Safety." And it's a good position to resign given what we're talking about, which is the risk of males, potentially predatory males, entering female-only spaces. The Telegraph continues, Nationalist MSPs to vote against the bill were Stephen O'Callaghan, Fergus Ewan, Kenneth Gibson, Ruth McGuire, John Mason, Michelle Thompson, Miss Reagan, and 2 abstained, Annabel Ewing and Jim Fairley. I would also point out that 2 Conservatives voted in favour. So it just shows you if the Conservatives can't conserve women's toilets, they can't conserve very much. The Telegraph continues, Maggie Chapman, Green MSP, strongly backs the reforms, and she suggested there would be a stepping stone to allowing children under 16 to legally change their sex. Quote, I am determined that appropriate gender recognition for under 16s and non-binary people will be part of our shared future, she said. And if you think that sounds creepy and Orwellian, that's because it is. Ms Sturgeon accused Ms Reagan of failing to raise her concerns with her. Or the minister in charge of the legislation. Ms Reagan had signed an open letter in 2019 expressing doubts about the changing definition of male and female. This is one of the things that will actually resonate from this. Here you've got a group of MSPs who are watching Nicola Sturgeon barefaced lie. Now, I've often wondered why she's in the position she is. I don't think she's intellectually capable, but she is very good at lying and showing no remorse at all. There's no sense of embarrassment. There's no sense of being caught in a lie. This seems to be her gift to politics. But here you see her colleagues are going to be seeing this. They're seeing her lie openly about them. So what this will do in the slightly longer term to her authority remains to be seen. But it's the first open rebellion against Ms Sturgeon and her woke agenda. And, well, good on them.
And David, if I can just add to that, we'll be coming back onto the subject of gender a little bit later in the news, because of course it seems to have also come to the surface in political circles in Cornwall, but more on that in a few minutes.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, then please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us out there, or you could pick something up at the UK Column shop. But please do share material that you see on the various platforms. And I just want to say thank you to everybody that assisted with the UKCB family fundraiser that we were talking about on Friday's programme. In fact, the figure is now very, very close to the £5,000 goal. I think they've got a few £100s to go at this point. So thank you very much for the response over the weekend.
Okay, well, let's hop back to the BBC and misinformation, because it appears that the BBC's own Marianna Spring is getting very excited because she's apparently prompted a panorama which is all about disaster trolls. So this is part of the big headline on the BBC. UK terror survivors tracked down by disaster trolls. And starts off with saying conspiracy theorists who claim UK terror attacks have been staged are tracking down survivors to their homes and workplaces to see if they're lying about their injuries. A BBC investigation has found Martin Hibbert, who was paralysed from the waist down when he and his daughter Eve were caught in the 2017 Manchester Arena blast, told the BBC is now preparing to bring a libel action against a conspiracy theorist based in Wales. So if we get into this and see what Ms Spring had to say, this is just some of the quotes from the article itself. For the past 5 months, I've been looking into conspiracy theorists who target UK terror survivors for BBC Panorama and a Radio 4 podcast. My investigations and new research, along with the testimony of those affected, show that conspiracy theories and tactics like those deployed by Mr. Hall, that's Richard D. Hall, are emblematic of a wider phenomenon that survivors and bereaved families are experiencing. She continues, a victim of the 2017 Westminster Bridge terror attack who has been harassed by online conspiracy trolls, told the BBC that surviving a terror attack now seems to inevitably lead to being abused. These types of conspiracy theories and the abuse they inspire echo those of Alex Jones. So I don't think we should be very surprised at what Marianna Spring has done there to conflate it with Alex Jones. The US host of the conspiracist show and website InfoWars, who this month was ordered to pay nearly $1 billion to families of the US Sandy Hook school shooting after falsely claiming the 20 12 attack was a hoax. I'm just going to put in here that Ms. Spring is not going to conduct any investigations in any of the claims made by the UK government and authorities over the Manchester attack. Anything the government says is taken, as being true by Marianna Spring, and I think we see some of the weaknesses here. But in this article, I want to introduce this particular lady because all of a sudden BBC monitoring comes in, and this is what the BBC said. Research from BBC monitoring found that dozens of videos promoting false claims about the Manchester attack, accumulating more than 300,000 views, were still on YouTube 5 years after the incident. After the BBC flagged this to YouTube, the company removed Mr. Hall's channel and one other that had promoted his content. So now we see the organisation BBC Monitoring, under the directorship of Liz Howell, coming in, is doing what, Mike? Spying on people in Britain? It certainly seems so. So if you're not sure what BBC Monitoring is, go and have a look on the BBC website. BBC Monitoring tracks, translates, analyses and summarises global media to help you make sense of world events. You're not capable of doing it yourself. You need these people to do it. And we can now add with certainty that BBC Monitoring is now also spying on the UK public. And if we want to know who's doing this, well, let's bring up the names that the BBC says. So we've got an Alistair Coleman and a Shayan Sardarizadeh, who we have mentioned before. But these are the two key people apparently looking at fake news, disinformation, and manipulation on digital platforms. Olga Robinson on the right there is doing the same in Russian media. But Shayan, we mentioned because we picked up a little while ago that he was busy putting out tweets and helping to inflame the situation in Iran, where there was the protest over the headscarves. So we picked up that he followed the UK column, and this was him declaring his work with BBC Monitoring and at BBC World. And here we put up a couple of tweets. This was back on the 26th of September, where this BBC employee is openly helping calls for regime change in Iran. So, Mark, if I just ask you on this one, you're there in the States. Many people in America think that the BBC is a glowing beacon of truth in the world. But here we see the BBC using its own people again to help inflame strife and trouble in foreign countries. If they're doing this, we can't trust them over their reports as to what's been happening in UK, surely.
Yeah, it's a total loss of distrust in the BBC. There's so many ways you could go with this. Over here, Elon Musk no sooner became owner of Twitter than he's already being accused of being someone who aids and abets conspiracy theories over the alleged invasion of the Pelosi home. Paul Pelosi, the husband of the U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And so the whole conspiracy theory meme is being attacked. In other words, it's as if there can be no such thing as a conspiracy at all. Now, in what Marianna Spring is talking about, one thing that occurred to me is they talk about all sorts of trolls, most of whom are anonymous. For all we know, and it's entirely conceivable, a lot of the trolls might be exaggerating things and claiming things that aren't technically true, and casting too wide of a net so as to discredit those who might have more legitimate conspiracy insights. So I'm sure Marianna Spring is not going to take those sorts of subterranean things into account. She looks to me quite young and naive, if I may say. Real reporting, you have to withhold your opinion and you have to look at all the angles and all the different possibilities. You can't make these calls or make these assessments in, a couple of minutes or whatever in this high turnover, got to have it now news age that we're living in. We want it and we want it now. And so anyone who's trying to do independent analysis is just called a conspiracy theory. And then, like you said, conflating it with Alex Jones, who, quite honestly, is not going to pay $1 billion. I can almost say categorically that's not going to happen. That's a good headline. It's good, flash in the pan kind of news. It gets a lot of attention, but it's very unlikely that he would pay anything even close to that amount in what was a very strange court trial, I might add, with lots of anomalies. So, yeah, the BBC, like the US media, is just attacking anyone who's investigative and conflating it all into one big distrustful conspiracy culture that they can then turn around and try and cancel. And a lot more could be said, but I think those are the essentials for right now.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mark. Well, let's just finish off with a couple of comments. Something in the article which I found interesting was Marianna Spring was talking about this. Stated nearly 1 in 5 people in the UK think terror survivors are not telling the truth about what happened to them. New research for the BBC suggests a third say the pandemic has made them more suspicious of official explanations of UK terror attacks. So the UK public is waking up to something, but of course Marianna Spring's line is that the UK public not really capable of understanding these difficult things itself. They're just being swayed by online trolls. She went on here, the survey of more than 4,000 people weighted to be representative of the UK population and carried out earlier this month by King's College London also suggests that 14% believe the 2017 Manchester Arena attack probably involved crisis actors who pretended to be injured.
That's quite an incredible statement. So again, we have the position that they take on one hand that people like Richard D. Hall are conspiracy theorists. Nobody really listens. It's a small niche audience and this kind of thing. And then the next hand they're saying that, in fact, the reach of Richard D. Hall is 14% of the population. Which way does it go?
Well, of course, the BBC doesn't know because it's not coming from a truthful, factual basis. It's floundering around in its own propaganda. And let's just put a BBC report up screen to finish this segment so there's no misunderstandings. Back in June 2021, the BBC News said Manchester Arena inquiry, bomb victims were failed at every level, family says. 22 people murdered in the Manchester Arena bomb were failed at every level by organisations criticised in a public inquiry report. Bomber Salman Abedi should have been identified as a threat by security, the inquiry chairman said. Now, my point here is, of course, the BBC and Marianna Spring have not got digging into the failures here as to what was really happening. They're attacking anybody who dares to ask questions. So let's finish the segment and put the lovely Marianna Spring back up on screen. And we'd just like to say that Richard D. Hall has published a response to what he calls the BBC Panorama propaganda. And you can find that written response if you go to the richplanet.net website. So we're under surveillance by the BBC. Any member of UK society who dares to challenge the government is going to find Marianna Spring on their case with Panorama. And yet we're supposedly fighting a war against the nasty Putin who's running a dictatorship. It's not funny at all.
David, let's move on then to the Mail here. And the headline is Christian nurse is to sue clinic over training course that said the Bible was racist for mentioning darkness.
Yes, this is Amy Gallagher, who we'll be interviewing in the next few days. So she's taking action against Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. Isn't everybody, including many of their patients? So she was forced to watch an online lecture saying that Christianity was part of the European oppression of black people. The Bible was racist because it mentioned lightness and darkness, and because Christianity is allegedly European, according to the Tavistock clinic, and European is bad. She also claims she was asked to attend an online seminar called Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time, which claimed that all white people are racist. So this is what your NHS is busy teaching the people who will be treating you. The Mail continues. She said the lecturer spoke negatively about Christianity, while no other religions were mentioned. When I questioned this, I was told the trust sees Christianity as responsible for racism because it's European. So the NHS Trust has taken an anti-Christian stance. Isn't that interesting? She said, that's when I started to feel as though I wasn't welcome on the course and I wasn't comfortable with these ideas. Ms. Gallagher, churchgoer, claims the lecturer was politically biased and had little or no reference to psychotherapy. Days later, she and other students were asked to attend a free public seminar online by Jungian psychoanalyst Helen Morgan called Whiteness a Problem for Our Time, which concluded, amongst other things, that white people are unconsciously racist as a matter of course. This is also reported in the Express. You see here, Christian nurse to sue mental health clinic over a course that dubbed the Bible racist. And, well, here we see the course, the Tavistock Policy Seminar, Whiteness a Problem for Our Time. It is really interesting. Why would an NHS Foundation Trust be pushing this, which is blatantly cultural Marxism? And why, we'll maybe come to this in detail later, why is it specifically Christianity they're going after? So it says, join us for a Tavistock Policy Seminar with Helen Morgan, examining white privilege and white fragility from a psychoanalytic perspective. So this is all cultural Marxist talking points. Spiked covered this and correctly expanded this into the bigger issue, the dangers of a woke NHS. They write, health service has no business indoctrinating its staff in critical race theory. They're calling out exactly what's going on here. He said, they write, cash is found for equality, diversity and inclusion officers who busy themselves compiling an A to Z of diversity to instruct staff on how white women can be actionable allies of people of colour. There are training courses on the history and principle of the Black Lives Matter movement, or by and large mansions, as I like to call them. And there's LGBT-themed tea and rainbow cake parties. And there's training on the importance of pronouns. All in this cash-strapped NHS, on your coin, more money being wasted. Spike continues, Paul Jenkins, Chief Executive of Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, told Gallagher that the Trust has, quote, committed itself to the explicit ambition of becoming an anti-racist organisation. And for those who don't know what anti-racist means, it doesn't mean you're against racism, right? They define racism as discrimination based on race that decreases equity, everyone having the same outcome. They define anti-racism as discrimination based on race that increases equity. So when they say anti-racist, they talk about basically moving white people down the list and whoever else they think is doing well, so that they're not treated on the basis of need, but you're treated on the basis of skin colour. So they're talking about bringing an inherently racist policy into the NHS. That's what that actually means. Spike continues, but being a Christian and questioning the validity of concepts like white privilege doesn't make someone racist. It does in the way the Portman NHS Trust define it. And they continue, Gallagher has stressed that she takes a colourblind approach to her work. And this is something that is being now viewed as problematic by the NHS management itself. A couple of quick slides here. These seminars are online. If you want to go and see exactly what the Tavistock NHS Trust have been saying, you can see the Tavistock Policy Seminar, Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time. Unfortunately, the comments are turned off. I can't imagine why. And you can also see the January 2021 seminar discussing the previous lecture. We've got here from New Discourses a definition of whiteness. It's well worth looking at if you're wanting to understand how the language is being changed. A couple of quick extracts. White people and people of colour in their own ways are expected to take up a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of anti-racism work as a result of the inherent complicity in whiteness. As critical race educator Robin D'Angelo puts it, the goal is not to construct a positive white identity, which is impossible, but instead to endeavour to become less white. This is what our NHS is teaching people. Continue here, people of colour on the other hand, are admonished that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and are therefore instructed to identify white methods, white empiricism, white science, and white mathematics as being manifestations of whiteness that need to be eschewed, avoided, criticised, and dismantled, including by acts of strategic resistance. So if you've got something like an NHS Trust that's dismantling what it sees as white science, by which we mean science, they're going to come up with increasingly irrational policy prescriptions and treatments for their patients. And they did just that. That's why they're being sued by a whole lot of the people they've mutilated when they actually needed compassion and counselling. So you're seeing the ideological takeover of an organisation here, but in other places you're seeing the effect of it in the toxic nature of how it then behaves. Quickly here, we just go to the Stand Up to Woke Tavistock discrimination crowdfunder. Already it's raised £99,500 out of £150,000 goal, so that's going very well. But if you can support that for that appeal by Amy Gallagher, please do.
Yeah, and it is important to support these things because, of course, we have to fight through the system, and if the system is through the courts, it invariably costs money. Is it worth doing it? In my opinion, it is. So if you feel you can contribute to that cause, we hope you will. Well, let's just move on to Mark Anderson here. Mark, you've been picking up some very interesting comment from, I have to say, that disgraceful man, Mr. Putin, who's challenging some of the views and values and indeed the morality that we're now seeing in the West. What have you picked up on?
Yeah, that's amazing what David was just talking about and reporting. A quick comment on it. This is a white piece of paper. Do I look white to you? And this is a black phone. Do I look, would a black person be that black? In other words, they talk as if white is not a color. You're either white or you're a person of color, when in fact all human beings are light tan to dark brown. And are they really separate races, or are we just different manifestations of one race? At any rate, whatever the answer to that question is, what they're instituting, what David is talking about, is literally the institutionalization of racism. They're actually increasing it. And it's part of this decadent West that is such a haunting thing to many of us. And now what you're showing here, one of my main items today, is the Russian Orthodox Bishop, Patriarch Kirill. He's 75 years old. And recently, there was the 24th World Russian People's Council that happened in latter October. And at that council, Patriarch Kirill, as it shows there, sees globalization as a threat to the family. And the quote that you're showing, globalization weakens deep spiritual connections between people and between God and man, Russian Patriarch Kirill said on Tuesday during the plenary session of the 24th World Russian People's Council. He, therefore, sees the globalizing world as a threat to families, as noted there on the screen. He went on to say, although globalization seems to unify the world, it ruptures deep relationships under the surface, as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church said, Mr. Kirill. He warned, he's concerned that people are alienated from each other, which leads to the collapse of communities, families, and a pandemic of loneliness, again, under globalization and the cultural system, part of which David described that it's bringing to bear. His greatest worry is the secularizing side effect of globalization. Quote, it destroys centuries-old cultural foundations and seeks to neutralize the traditional moral principles in societal life. In the process, religious institutions that attempt to adapt to the changing world or adapt to globalization may lose their identity, as there is no place for God there. And he went on to say, to deal with the challenges of globalization, there are two options, Kirill argued. The first, he says, is adapting and subordinating religion to the requirements of globalism. This path is followed by our colleagues in the West, he added, including those who call themselves Christians. He thinks Christian churches, that is, Kirill thinks Christian churches go along with the trends of globalization simply to avoid criticism. However, this path does not save the spiritual life of society from decline, but accelerates this process of decline. The other option, he added, is to keep traditions and religious values as they are. Quote, it requires an open witness to the truth, regardless of the pressure and negative reaction from external forces, including globalist ones, the Patriarch concluded. So some very interesting things that you wouldn't necessarily have heard on your evening news from the BBC or the CBC or NBC or any of them. And of course, it's worth noting that Alexander Dugin, described as a longtime Russian dissident, an anti-communist during the 1980s, he also spoke at this 24th World Russian People's Council. And he said many things. He said, for example, and this is just a short excerpt, it is very important that we are confronted with an idea. The West is an ideology. Liberalism, globalism, secularism, and posthumanism are ideologies. This is the realm of ideas, not the realm of matter, bodies, and technology. Above all, it is an absolute lie. It is the overturning of the true proportions of the mind, of ideas, of religious foundations. And so he too, like the Patriarch, criticized the decadent underbelly, secularism, atheism, globalism, and all that, all the isms of the West. And they are deserving things. The West deserves really all of these criticisms because of the dire consequences that they bring about. And it affects so many areas. And the Patriarch also included something important to mention before I conclude on this item. We include measures to support the value level. For example, the recognition of the dignity of human life, and get this, the removal of abortions from compulsory medical insurance systems, and a ban on LGBT propaganda and destructive content like that. So it's a pretty comprehensive message there at that council, at that meeting that was put forth, and it provides a powerful counter narrative to this Western decadence that we see all around us. And I mainly wanted to get it out there because it's very difficult to find anywhere in the mainstream news. So it's important to get that full picture out there.
Okay, Mark, thank you for that. We live in extraordinary times, don't we? We have to really sift through the news in order to see what appears to be common sense and morality, and then we find it coming from another side of the world. That's a big shock to the Western mind. Now, you also picked up on the fact that it had been reported a little while ago that PayPal had apparently decided that if you weren't telling the party line, they were going to fine you. I remember seeing a little bit about this, but you've got a very interesting little video clip here where some American commentators are talking about what PayPal tried to do. Let's have a listen.
You've noticed that PayPal's stock price tumbled earlier this week after the company sent out a proposed rule change that it later said was an error. Yet the head of the federal government's top consumer watchdog agency is looking closely at the company's recent moves, and Sharon Epperson joins us now with more. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Joe. An update to a PayPal policy that said users promoting misinformation could be subject to damages of $2,500 drew sharp criticism last weekend. Then a PayPal spokesperson said that notice, quote, went out in error and included incorrect information, adding, quote, PayPal is not fining people for misinformation. Still, the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is keeping a close eye on developments.
I've never actually heard of a payment system thinking that they could fine someone for legal expression that their users are making.
CFPB Director Rohit Chopra says banks have authority to make sure there's no fraud or illegal activity in transactions, but fintech companies having the power to decide who can say what and who will get fined as a result needs to be scrutinized.
We have ordered all the big tech, most of the major big tech firms and payment companies to provide us with information about how are they making decisions about who they kick off their platforms, but we also need to look into whether they believe they can be fining users for legal activities.
Chopra says the CFPB has to understand the facts of this case, but he says fintech companies deciding on their own when to deduct fines from customer accounts and under what circumstances is new territory, and his agency is looking into it.
It sounds like a great business.
Well, that says it all, Mark. Dangerous territory.
Yeah, this is an important development. As we've talked about on this show, the private sector has taken on such unprecedented powers and functions in the U.S. and beyond, basically taking over the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law limiting freedom of speech, among other things it says in the First Amendment. But what good does that do if you use channels of freedom of speech to try and exercise that freedom, including social media, and that social media can make what amounts to a, quote, law and either edit or get rid of what you've been trying to say and either limit what you're saying or take you off the platform altogether. And what Mr. Chopra is talking about would be another step up in that whole process where a company like PayPal would actually be able to fine you. Now, issuing a fine in the technical sense is an action of government, like a citation, like a traffic ticket almost. It's almost as if PayPal wanted to be the traffic cop of cyber traffic and issue citations or tickets because you have the wrong point of view and you have what they consider and what they define as disinformation or misinformation. So even though it's during the Biden administration, and that's rather surprising here, still, this is a very welcome thing on the part of that Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, and the director Chopra to do this. I'll mention, too, that on October 12, just a point of clarity, after significant criticism, PayPal announced it was canceling its policy on fining customers for political views. But according to multiple reports, the language in question still remains buried in PayPal's terms of service. So PayPal's denial that they're going to continue this fining process has to be looked at very carefully. Are they really going to totally pull back from fining people, or are they just going to go into kind of a wait and see mode and test the waters and roll it out later, maybe in a more subtle fashion? So that would be an important thing to look for in the immediate aftermath of this announcement.
That is the key point, Mark, because as somebody mentioned in the chat box, the $2,500 thing has been in their terms and conditions for quite a long time, for a couple of years, I believe. But what was new in this case was this new clause which brought in this concept of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, none of which was defined. So therefore, it was completely arbitrary. Now they've removed the misinformation, disinformation, hate speech clause out again because they get caught with their pants down. But they still have the term obscenity in there, and that was also not defined. And so it's still unclear exactly under what circumstances they would be issuing those fines in inverted commas. And we also have to remember that what they were proposing was $2,500 per infringement of their terms of service. So it wasn't limited to $2,500 at all. And it could potentially, if they just would take the money out of somebody's bank account potentially. So it's quite a significant thing that we've got to keep an eye on. They've done this type of thing in the past, and they have walked back from it in the past on a completely different area of their terms and conditions, and then they've brought it back 6 months later. And because people weren't paying attention anymore, they've managed to keep it there. So I think the key thing is we've got to keep an eye on them and make sure they don't bring this back in a few months' time.
Yeah.
And it's also, I'll quickly mention, it's also encouraging that Mr. Chopra said he's writing to all the social media companies, not just PayPal, to ask them exactly how they go about gauging this stuff and how they go about making these decisions. So this is a very welcome and really belated action on the part of the U.S. government. Better late than never. But yeah, that would be per infraction. And of course, when you make the government analogy, why are private companies being given almost governmental-like powers? In a government, if you're fined or given some sort of penalty, you can appeal it in a court. But through these companies, what appeal process do you really have that you would consider even worthy of calling an appeal process? So this privatization of the protection of speech, hopefully this is the beginning of the end of that.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, David.
Yeah, moving on. We talked before about the targeting of Christianity, and there's a reason why that is the case, and we'll come to that in a little while. We've got some more examples. These are all courtesy of the Metropolitan Police Service. So here we've got the Mail Online. Met Police apologises to Christian preacher and pays £10,000 in damages after she was wrongly arrested twice at Speaker's Corner. She complained to officers about threats by Islamic protesters, and they arrested her. They've had to pay her £10,000 in damages, and she claims she was unlawfully imprisoned and wrongfully arrested. The Mail continues. Hatun Tash was twice arrested at Speaker's Corner. She often visits the park to debate and critique Islam and the Quran, or the holy book, the Quran, the Mail writes, which would spark backlash from the community. Instead of offering her support, the Times reported Ms. Tash was arrested both times she approached police officers and accused of breaching the peace or committing a similar public order offence. The evangelist brought legal action against Scotland Yard after she was held in custody for 24 hours before being released without charge because she'd done nothing apart from being the victim of a crime. We've got here who is Hatun Tash. I'll not go into this in detail, but she's a former Muslim from Turkey. She's a regular at Speaker's Corner, and she's extremely courageous. We see just how courageous here in the next slide. She was attacked and stabbed. The woman with blood on her face, the police didn't arrest her that time, but that's the person they've been arresting. She was stabbed by an Islamic protester who didn't like what she was saying. This is not the only case. We've got another one. We've got the Telegraph reporting here, vindicated Christian preachers to sue Met after hate speech case thrown out. Hazel Lewis has cleared the name after 18-month legal battle. So this takes huge chunks out of people's lives, in which she was accused of using threatening language. She's to sue the police after being dragged through the courts, despite officers acknowledging that the accuser had goaded her and she refused to take the bait. Hazel Lewis, 49, was arrested while preaching after passers-by falsely claimed she'd called for gays and non-believers to be stabbed. She said the police were determined to prosecute me no matter what. She said the members of the public wanted to silence me and twist what I was saying. The police seemed determined to prosecute me. Christian Concern are sticking up for her, and they are writing here about the case. The case was eventually, the accusation was she was using homophobic and racist language. I suspect neither was true. Even looking at her, you've got to think that doesn't make an awful lot of sense because she's of African or West Indian origin herself. And when it finally came to court after the 18 months, the judge threw it out as there was no case to answer, which does beg the question, what on earth the police thought they were doing. Hazel commented, it's taken nearly 18 months. I'm delighted the judge has seen through the lies and has vindicated me. When the police arrived, despite me telling them that the allegations were false, they still arrested me without any evidence other than from members of the public who wanted to silence me and twist what I was saying. Despite this experience, I'm determined to keep preaching. Since the pandemic began, I've seen more and more Christians taken to the streets of London to preach. And it's not the only one. Here we've got a third. We've previously covered this, but just to recap on it. The Met Police pay out again after a Southgate preacher was wrongfully arrested. The footage of this man, whose name I won't attempt, pleading with the police not to take my Bible away, has been viewed online 3 million times. In a video posted online, he was seen telling police Jesus is away. An officer who arrested him for breaching the peace can be heard replying, I appreciate that, but no one wants to listen to that. They want you to go away. So when he tries to keep hold of his Bible, an officer says, you should have thought of that before being racist. So again, this black man is accused of being racist by the Met Police. Seems to be a bit of a pattern here. And we've reported on this in Bristol, different police area, but still in England. Police versus Christians, can Dia Moodley preach? So that's online, and that's an interview with Dia Moodley about his experience trying to find the freedom to speak in public about his faith in Britain. It's being criminalised, and the police are his opponents. And those who are trying to silence him, which tend to be LGBTQ 2A+, tends to be some Muslims, tends to be some. He was getting complaints from atheists as well who were offended. All of this seems to be enough. If there's a complaint, the police seem to shut down Christianity. This shows there's a culture which is hostile towards Christianity inbuilt now within the police. Now, the reason for that is the whole cultural Marxist world is itself a religion, and it's a religion that has explicitly sought from the outset to replace Christianity. The reason they go after it is they see that as a threat, and they see it as something that they need to replace in order to bring about the world that they want to create. And that world is one of their version of utopia. More on that perhaps in extra time.
Okay, David, thank you for that. Well, by an amazing coincidence, I picked up on one particular email today, a concerned parent in Cornwall. They said to me, do you realise that this is being pushed at school children in Cornwall? It's the school's transgender guidance, but the real sting is who has produced this. The Intercom Trust, Devon and Cornwall Police, and Cornwall Council. So we've now got the police embedded in education. These are the editors that are shown from the particular document. We've got a Steve Cannon from the Grassroots Community Advocate, a grassroots community advocate, lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans communities, also connected to the Intercom Trust. Toby Best, Devon and Cornwall Police, diversity officer, and published by the Intercom Trust, Devon and Cornwall Police. So documentation which is going into schools. This is the forward. Thank you to all of the young people that identify as trans or as gender non-conforming, their parents, carers and guardians that contributed to the initial creation and inspired this revised edition. And then it goes on to talk, of course, about Cornwall Council, the Intercom Trust, and Devon and Cornwall Police. So if you objected to this, what do you think might happen if you made a fuss? Do you think that perhaps the police would be on your doorstep? I think highly likely. Let's have a look at the photographs of the people who signed this document. They were upfront enough to put themselves. So we've got Trevor Doughty, Corporate Director, Education, Health and Social Care, Cornwall Council. Dr. Michael Halls, Executive Director, the Intercom Trust, lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans community resource in the Southwest. And Assistant Chief Constable Sharon Taylor, Devon and Cornwall Police. So just before I show one more slide on this, David, just to come back to you. So now the police are fully embedded in creation of the policy in the first place. So as I say, you protest what this is trying to do with the minds of young children in particular. And of course, the police are going to be hostile from the start because they have been involved in creating the document that you dislike. It's in our faces what's happening here, which is a dictatorship.
Yes, and it's a dictatorship that's very proud of itself, because we have here Devon and Cornwall Police honoured the professionalism and commitment of police officers, staff and volunteers from the Cornwall policing area. PC Toby Best received a Chief Superintendent's commendation for his contribution to producing a pioneering document, the Cornwall Schools Transgender Guidance, in cooperation with Intercom Trust, Devon and Cornwall Police, Cornwall Council and head teachers. So you got an award for that. You got patted on the head. Good boy.
Yeah. Well, I'll just pop this one on screen if people want to go and have a look at the Intercom Trust at least. Mike, you'll be happy because it's professional, it's accountable, and it's transparent.
Is it independent?
Well, I didn't see the independent word, but it's certainly not independent of the police. But we better leave that segment there. What are these people after? They're after the minds of our children. And I think this is becoming very clear. So we've one image, I think, which we should end on today. If we can just call it up, that will be good. And
which one?
That
one?
That's the one there,
Okay.
yes, the anonymous one. Thank you, Mike. Now, I'm not sure who created this, or sorry, who saw this one. I think it's you, David.
I got it from a UK column viewer just a few minutes before I was sending the slides through. So thank you very much to that viewer. So here we see the Russians monitoring Liz Truss's phone, and they're a bit disappointed because of the banal nature of the content. My God, they say it's just thousands of selfies. I suspect that might not be true, if only it was.
Indeed. And I think we'll say that certainly in the UK column, this morning, having a look at Liz Truss and having a look at how she changed in a very short time as Prime Minister, I think at the end of the day, she was really beginning to decline in a mental sense, because clearly she was believing the propaganda fed into her. So there's a story that she was particularly worried about the direction of the wind, because if it was coming from the east, that was going to bring the nuclear fallout from the Russians bombing, nuclear bomb threat. So I think Liz Truss needs a little bit of support. We'll end there. David and Mark, thank you very much for joining us. And as Mike has said, a very big thank you to all the people who are supporting what we're doing, because it's been your support, and in particular your financial support, that's allowing the UK column to grow. And of course, that also means we're able to produce better and more research material. And your latest effort with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Mike, I think is truly exceptional. So get digging into that database and start asking yourself where this money has come from that the government can simply hand out like confetti. We'll leave it there.
Extra in a couple of minutes.
Extra time in a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.